The arrival of spring in 1943 brought a new wave of consternation for the commanders of the 8th Air Force, whose English headquarters were inundated with distressing loss reports. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially heralded as an invincible aerial weapon, had entered the theater of operations with grand promises. This formidable machine, a 7-ton marvel of American engineering, was built around the most potent radial engine ever integrated into a single-seat fighter aircraft. However, the harsh realities encountered over the skies of occupied Europe painted a starkly different picture, one etched in the grim spectacle of smoke trails and the melancholic emptiness of chairs at post-mission debriefings. The 56th Fighter Group had initiated their combat operations with the Thunderbolts on April 8, 1943, tasked with providing escort for B-17 bombers targeting German industrial complexes. Within a mere fortnight, the pilots' reports began to filter back, causing considerable apprehension among procurement officials situated in Washington. The P-47 was consistently described as sluggish and unresponsive below 15,000 feet, an altitude where the agile Focke-Wulf FW-190s effortlessly outmaneuvered the heavier American fighters. Its rate of climb proved disappointing, and its turning radius was, frankly, a source of embarrassment. To compound these woes, the Luftwaffe had already devised a cunning tactic, a head-on pass followed by a swift split S maneuver, which allowed their pilots to vanish from sight before the Thunderbolt pilots could even bring their guns to bear. Colonel Hubert Zemke, the commanding officer of the 56th, spent those initial weeks absorbing the complaints from his pilots, who derisively referred to their aircraft as the 7-ton milk jug. The Thunderbolt's prodigious fuel consumption meant that providing meaningful escort time deep over German territory remained an elusive dream. Pilots would cross the English Channel, protect the bombers for a fleeting 30 minutes, and then be compelled to turn back as their fuel reserves dwindled. Meanwhile, the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and FW-190s patiently awaited the Thunderbolt's departure, then descended upon the bomber formations with devastating impunity. The tactical situation was further exacerbated by the critical blind spots created by the P-47's Razorback canopy, transforming the vital act of checking one's 6 into an awkward and often inadequate neck-swiveling exercise. Luftwaffe pilots exploited these vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency, positioning themselves within these dead zones before unleashing their devastating firepower. After-action reports from April and early May meticulously documented numerous instances of P-47s being ambushed from above and behind, with the first chilling indication of an attack often being the impact of 20mm cannon shells tearing through the fuselage. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. By the middle of May 1943, a quiet murmur of concern had begun to circulate among some staff officers, with suggestions that the P-47 program might represent a colossal billion-dollar miscalculation. The aircraft performed exquisitely at 25,000 feet and above, where its turbocharged engine delivered a performance that could rival or even surpass any German fighter. However, aerial combat seldom remained at such lofty altitudes. Dogfights invariably spiraled downwards, and in the lower reaches of the sky, the Thunderbolt frequently became prey rather than predator. Worse still, early combat losses hinted that the aircraft was not absorbing battle damage with the resilience that engineers had promised. 3 P-47s had been lost within the first month due to what appeared to be relatively minor damage engine fires, structural failures, and control problems that ultimately proved fatal. The 78th Fighter Group joined the 56th in operations during April, and their experiences merely reinforced the existing problems. Pilots reported a noticeable emboldening among German fighters, who pressed their attacks with greater aggression and for longer durations than they had against other American aircraft types. Intelligence officers posited that the Luftwaffe had meticulously studied the P-47's performance envelope, identifying its exploitable weaknesses, attacking from below and behind, forcing the Thunderbolt into a turning engagement, and specifically targeting its large radial engine with incendiary rounds. It appeared that standard Luftwaffe doctrine was undergoing an evolution specifically designed to counteract American tactics. Robert S. Johnson had been flying P-47s with the 61st Fighter Squadron, a component of the 56th Fighter Group, since March 1943. By late May, he had accumulated sufficient combat hours to intimately understand the Thunderbolt's strengths, while simultaneously cursing its inherent weaknesses. The aircraft possessed a formidable, almost reassuring solidity in its sheer mass. Yet that very bulk rendered it ponderous and unwieldy in a close-quarters aerial engagement. Johnson had witnessed squadron mates commit fatal errors, attempting to outturn the nimble FW-190s or trying to climb away from diving BF-109s. And he had attended the somber gatherings that followed when those pilots failed to return home. Yet there remained an unanswered question, one far more critical than speed, climb rate, or turn radius. What truly happened when a P-47 sustained severe damage? When German guns found their mark and tore into that massive airframe, could the Thunderbolt absorb the punishment and continue to fly? Or would it disintegrate like any other fighter once battle damage exceeded its structural limits? Engineering reports offered one prognosis: actual combat would render the definitive verdict. And on May 26, 1943, Johnson was poised to provide the answer everyone had been waiting for, even if he harbored no desire for the task. The morning of May 26, 1943, dawned much like any other mission day at Horsham St. Faith Airfield. A cold English drizzle permeated the air, accompanied by the nervous rituals of pre-flight checks and the ceaseless activity of ground crews swarming over P-47s that seemed to require constant attention. Johnson's aircraft that day bore the standard Republic Aviation serial number 428487, a Thunderbolt that had accumulated approximately 40 combat hours without encountering anything more dramatic than a few minor flak dings. The mission briefing outlined a seemingly straightforward bomber escort run to Santo in northern France, with the objective of protecting B-17s as they targeted German airfields and rail yards. The 56th Fighter Group launched 58 P-47s that morning, forming up meticulously over the English coast before heading southeast across the Channel. Johnson flew as part of the 61st Fighter Squadron's second element, tucked securely into the formation, where he maintained visual contact with his flight leader while vigilantly scanning the sky for any dark specks that might signify impending danger. For once, the weather was cooperative. Scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, with clear skies above and visibility extending for miles. These were ideal conditions for spotting both the bomber formations below and potential enemy fighters above. They penetrated French airspace at an altitude of 26,000 feet, with throttles precisely set for maximum endurance. The bomber stream stretched out beneath them, a seemingly endless procession of 17 groups of B-17s heading towards their targets. presenting an orderly appearance from altitude but representing a controlled chaos up close. Johnson's theoretical mission was simple: to keep German fighters away from these bombers until their fuel levels necessitated the P-47's return to base. In practice, this demanded unceasing vigilance, constant neck swiveling, and eyes burning from the relentless strain of staring into the bright sky, searching for enemy aircraft that could materialize from any direction. The first ominous sign of trouble emerged at 13:15 hours when Johnson's wingman urgently called out, "Bandits!" at 4 o'clock high. Johnson sharply turned his head, squinting through the P-47's canopy framework, and caught the unmistakable glint of sunlight reflecting off enemy canopies. Focke-Wulf FW-190s, perhaps 8 or 10 of them, were diving from 28,000 feet, capitalizing on their altitude advantage, and the speed derived from a perfectly executed bounce. The German formation split as it descended, with some fighters angling towards the vulnerable bombers, while others specifically targeted the P-47 escorts. Johnson's flight leader promptly ordered a hard right turn to counter the impending threat, and the Thunderbolts responded with the characteristic sluggishness that so often prompted P-47 pilots to curse their aircraft's substantial weight. The FW-190s continued their relentless descent, and Johnson realized with the stark clarity unique to combat that the geometry of the situation was decidedly not in the Americans' favor. The Germans had timed their bounce flawlessly, catching the P-47s in the midst of a formation turn, a moment when individual aircraft were most susceptible to attack. What transpired next unfolded in the compressed, distorted time frame that combat pilots frequently describe, everything occurring simultaneously, yet also feeling as if it were happening in slow motion. Johnson saw tracers arc menacingly past his canopy, heard the jarring metallic hammering of rounds impacting his aircraft, and felt the P-47 shudder violently under the force of the blows. His initial instinct proved correct: execute a sharp break to the left, thereby spoiling the attacker's aim and extricating himself from the line of fire. He hauled the stick over, and the Thunderbolt responded, but not with sufficient alacrity. The FW-190 that had singled out Johnson belonged to a Luftwaffe pilot who, with chilling precision, knew exactly how to destroy P-47s, or at least believed he did. The German fighter closed to a distance of less than 200 yards, a virtually point-blank range where even mediocre gunnery could yield devastating results, and unleashed a torrent of fire from every weapon mounted in its wings: 4 20mm MG 151 cannons and 2 7.92mm machine guns, delivering approximately 1,600 rounds per minute of combined firepower, all concentrated on Johnson's Thunderbolt as the two aircraft converged in a crossing shot that should have been fatal. Johnson felt his P-47 stagger violently as cannon shells ripped into the engine cowling, the fuselage directly behind the cockpit, and the right wing. The canopy panel immediately beside his head starred from a bullet impact that, miraculously, failed to penetrate. A cascade of warning lights illuminated his instrument panel. Oil pressure plummeted, hydraulic pressure vanished, and engine temperature soared into the red zone. The control stick felt alarmingly wrong in his hand, mushy and unresponsive, as if the control cables had been partially severed. The FW-190 flashed past, and Johnson instinctively searched for it, knowing the German pilot would either break away or circle back for a finishing pass. What he saw instead sent a chilling wave through him. The Focke-Wulf was indeed turning back, meticulously lining up for another attack, and Johnson's grievously crippled Thunderbolt was in no condition to maneuver. The remainder of his flight had scattered in the chaos of the initial bounce, either pursuing other German fighters or diving away from the ambush. Johnson was utterly alone, severely wounded, and on the precipice of enduring a second burst of fire from an enemy pilot, who clearly sought confirmation of his kill. I'm from the United States, and I find the video topic fascinating. It really highlights how initial combat impressions of aircraft can be misleading, and how crucial pilot adaptation and tactical evolution are in warfare. It underscores the human element in overcoming technological shortcomings. The German pilot, seeking unequivocal confirmation of his kill, initiated a second pass. With an almost instructional precision, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 glided into position from Johnson's 7 o'clock, presenting a stark contrast to Johnson's desperate struggle to elicit any form of evasive action from his severely compromised Thunderbolt. The American pilot could only manage a meager 15-degree bank before the aircraft's controls seized completely, the vital cables either severed by gunfire or inextricably jammed by contorted metal. Recognizing a defenseless adversary, the German ace deliberately closed the distance, reaching what Johnson later estimated to be a mere 150 yards. This proximity afforded Johnson a chillingly clear view of the enemy aircraft's intricate cowling, its gleaming spinner, and even what appeared to be celebratory victory markings emblazoned upon its fuselage. The ensuing second burst of fire, lasting perhaps 3 agonizing seconds, inflicted truly catastrophic damage upon Johnson's P-47. Explosive cannon shells tore through the Thunderbolt's tail section, violently obliterating substantial portions of its rudder and elevator. Additional rounds relentlessly ascended the fuselage's dorsal spine. Each brutal impact resonated through the airframe as a distinct metallic clang, a sensation Johnson experienced as much through his body as through his hearing. His right wing suffered numerous direct hits, with one particularly devastating shell detonating within the main spar, causing the entire wing to contort and flex in a manner fundamentally unnatural for an aircraft structure. The instrument panel directly before him disintegrated in a shower of destruction. Glass shards erupted, needles spun wildly and erratically, and the electrical systems short-circuited in dazzling cascades of sparks. Then, a 20mm shell struck the canopy rail, a mere 18 inches from Johnson's head. Although the round remarkably failed to penetrate the cockpit, the sheer force of the impact fractured the plexiglass into a complex spiderweb pattern, transforming his forward visibility into an utterly distorted and blurry tableau. Fragments of shrapnel peppered the right side of his flight suit, and he felt a disconcerting warmth of blood trickling down his neck, though he would only later ascertain that he had sustained injuries to his shoulder and ear. The cockpit rapidly filled with an acrid smoke, its origin, whether from electrical fires or battle damage, remaining indistinguishable while the pungent ammonia scent of hydraulic fluid mingled with the biting cordite aroma of exploding shells. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Johnson's instinctive reaction, under such dire circumstances, should have been to abandon the stricken aircraft. The P-47 was undeniably in its death throes, systems were failing across the board, Its structural integrity was, at best, highly questionable. Yet an inexplicable force prevented him from reaching for the canopy jettison handle. Perhaps it was the considerable altitude, still hovering around 24,000 feet, a height that promised a protracted parachute descent directly into the range of German ground fire. Perhaps it was the vast distance somewhere over northern France, with a daunting 50 miles of hostile territory separating him from the relative safety of the English Channel. Or perhaps most profoundly, it was the inherent stubbornness of a fighter pilot, an unwavering refusal to relinquish an aircraft that, despite all evidence, was still technically airborne, even if flying had become a remarkably generous descriptor for its perilous state. The FW-190 disengaged after that second devastating pass, leaving Johnson to brace for the inevitable third attack that would surely seal his fate. He waited 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. Nothing materialized. He cautiously risked a glance over his shoulder through the crazed and fractured canopy, and observed the German fighter gracefully orbiting approximately 500 yards behind him, neither initiating another attack nor departing, simply observing. Later, Johnson would comprehend the German pilot's rationale. The P-47 was unequivocally finished, visibly doomed, already trailing plumes of smoke and shedding debris. Why expend precious ammunition on an aircraft that was destined to plummet from the sky of its own accord within a matter of minutes? However, against all odds, the Thunderbolt steadfastly refused to crash. The formidable Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a marvel of engineering, continued its relentless operation despite sustaining multiple direct cannon hits to its accessory section. Oil pressure had plummeted to an alarming near zero, and the coolant temperature was steadily climbing past limits that should have, by all engineering principles, caused the engine to seize irrevocably. Yet, those 18 powerful cylinders persisted in firing, in turning the propeller, in generating just enough thrust to maintain something remotely resembling controlled flight. Johnson cautiously eased the throttle back, attempting to alleviate the immense thermal load, and the engine responded with a disconcerting cough and a violent shudder. But remarkably, it did not quit. His immediate and pressing concern was not the engine itself, rather, it was the catastrophic loss of control. The elevator cables had either been completely severed or inextricably jammed, leaving him with virtually no pitch authority. The rudder was partially destroyed, affording him perhaps a mere 20% of normal yaw control. The ailerons, though damaged, still functioned, albeit barely, though the compromised right wing transformed any banking motion into a perilous gamble. Through painstaking experimentation, Johnson discovered that he could maintain a more or less level flight path by constantly adjusting power and meticulously utilizing the trim tabs. But any maneuver more aggressive than the gentlest turn threatened to send the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin or precipitate a catastrophic structural failure. The second formidable challenge was navigation. His compass had been utterly destroyed in the brutal carnage of the instrument panel. His radio was completely dead, and the severely cracked canopy distorted familiar landmarks beyond any hope of recognition. Johnson possessed a general understanding of England's direction, west and slightly north, but precise navigation was an absolute impossibility. He selected a heading based on the sun's angle and his mental mapping of the French coastline, then dedicated his entire focus to the monumental task of keeping the Thunderbolt airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. It was at this critical juncture that the oil smoke intensified dramatically. The engine was quite literally consuming itself. Metal components were expanding far beyond their design tolerances, bearings were running dry, and cylinder heads were beginning to glow a ominous cherry red behind the cowling. Johnson could now distinctly smell it, the unmistakable odor of burning oil mingling with hot metal, and something else he couldn't precisely identify, but instinctively recognized as profoundly detrimental. Every single cylinder firing was another minor miracle. Every revolution of that propeller represented borrowed time. The few gauges that still functioned displayed conditions that Republic's engineers would have unequivocally declared impossible. An engine, by all conventional wisdom, should not have continued running under such extreme parameters, yet it stubbornly did. The P-47's astonishing survival ultimately hinged upon crucial engineering decisions, made 2 years prior, in a Republic aviation design room located on Long Island. These choices, which at the time might have seemed excessively robust, proved to be nothing short of providential over the skies of France. Alexander Kartveli, Republic's visionary chief designer, had conceived and built the Thunderbolt around a design philosophy that other aircraft manufacturers considered wasteful, an unwavering commitment to making every component stronger than strictly necessary, incorporating redundancy wherever feasible and never, under any circumstances, sacrificing structural integrity for marginal weight savings. The tangible result. This philosophy was an aircraft that, while weighing 3,000 pounds more than a Messerschmitt Bf 109, possessed an unparalleled capacity to absorb battle damage that would have unequivocally shredded German fighters into mere falling debris. The very core of this extraordinary survivability was the magnificent Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial powerhouse displacing 2,800 cubic inches and generating an astonishing 2,000 horsepower at war emergency power. Radial engines inherently possessed significant advantages in terms of combat damage tolerance, qualities that inline engines simply could not emulate. The circular arrangement of the cylinders in a radial configuration meant that the loss of 1 or even 3 cylinders to enemy fire still left a remarkable 15 functional combustion chambers. In stark contrast, an inline engine such as the Allison V1710 found in the P-40 or the Merlin in the Spitfire concentrated all 12 of its cylinders within a narrow block. A single, well-placed cannon shell could catastrophically crack the engine block or sever the crankshaft, instantly incapacitating the entire power plant. Johnson's resilient engine had endured at least 6 direct hits, 3 of which were 20mm cannon shells that had violently punched through the accessory case and obliterated the oil pump housing. Under normal operational circumstances, the loss of oil pressure would invariably lead to engine failure within a mere 90 seconds, as bearings seized and pistons welded themselves to cylinder walls. However, the R-2800's immense thermal mass and robust construction bought precious time. The engine was undeniably destroying itself, but it was doing so slowly, each revolution relentlessly grinding away metal and generating heat that could not be dissipated. It was dying, but at a rate measured in minutes rather than fleeting seconds. The airframe itself incorporated structural redundancies that were conspicuously absent in other contemporary fighters. Republic had meticulously constructed the P-47 around a massive internal structure, heavy-gauge longerons, powerfully reinforced bulkheads, and a wing spar engineered to effortlessly handle loads far exceeding normal flight stresses. This deliberate overkill construction undoubtedly added weight, but it simultaneously created a damage-tolerant structure where the severing of one load path did not immediately culminate in catastrophic failure. Johnson's right wing had sustained a 20mm shell strike that destroyed 6 feet of its rear spar. Yet the robust front spar and skin continued to bear sufficient load to keep the wing securely attached. A lighter, less robust structure would have folded instantly. The control system of the Thunderbolt demonstrated a similar philosophy of redundancy. P-47 control cables were routed through heavily armored channels and utilized a dual cable arrangement for all critical flight surfaces. When cannon fire severed Johnson's primary elevator cables, backup cables maintained a partial, albeit degraded, control authority. The system was severely compromised, barely functional, but it was functional enough to keep the aircraft pointed in something resembling the correct direction. This stands in stark contrast to the Focke-Wulf FW-190, which employed a sophisticated but inherently vulnerable hydraulic control system. A single hit to a hydraulic line meant the complete and instantaneous loss of that particular control surface. Even the fuel system of the P-47 reflected Kartvel's almost paranoid design philosophy. The Thunderbolt carried its fuel in meticulously designed self-sealing tanks, further protected by armor plating and strategically positioned to minimize any risk of fire. These tanks utilized a specialized rubber compound developed by the U.S. Rubber Company, which possessed the remarkable property of swelling and sealing when exposed to fuel, effectively closing bullet holes before any significant fuel loss could occur. Johnson's aircraft had sustained multiple machine gun rounds through the left main tank, but the ingenious self-sealing mechanism functioned precisely as designed. The holes closed, fuel loss ceased, and the critical risk of fire remained remarkably manageable. The danger of an uncontrolled blaze persisted, yet it was surprisingly contained. The robust canopy, which had been significantly marked but not utterly destroyed by the enemy's cannon fire, was crafted from laminated bulletproof glass, measuring precisely 3.4 of an inch in thickness. This formidable material possessed the inherent strength to resist armor-piercing projectiles up to a .50 caliber. When the 20mm shell struck, it did so at an acute, glancing angle, effectively dispersing the immense kinetic energy of the impact over a considerably broader surface. Consequently, the specialized glass fractured but impressively maintained its structural integrity, its integrated laminate layers crucially averting the kind of devastating fragmentation that would have propelled dangerous plexiglass shards directly into Johnson's face and eyes. In stark contrast, typical German fighter aircraft were equipped with conventional plexiglass canopies, which, while undeniably lighter and more economical to produce, afforded absolutely no ballistic defense whatsoever to their pilots. Furthermore, the Republic aviation engineers had meticulously engineered the placement of vital operational systems, anticipating the inevitable damage inflicted during aerial combat. Key components, such as the radio apparatus, the complex electrical networks, and the essential hydraulic reservoirs, were intelligently dispersed across various sections of the fuselage, rather than being dangerously consolidated within a single, easily compromised area. In Johnson's predicament, his aircraft's hydraulic functionality had been completely lost, his communication radio utterly incapacitated, and a significant half of his electrical power grid rendered inoperable. Nevertheless, the indispensable engine ignition system operated via a distinct and isolated electrical bus, which, remarkably, had endured the onslaught. Moreover, the magnetos, responsible for generating the sparks necessary to ignite the fuel, were ingeniously engine-driven and entirely autonomous from the primary electrical infrastructure. This thoughtful and deliberate implementation of redundancy represented yet another critical design feature that ensured the engine continued its operation even as numerous other critical systems succumbed to failure. This particular engineering ethos, prioritizing ruggedness and survivability above all else, naturally incurred significant expenses, which were often viewed with disdain by financial auditors focused on peacetime economies. The production of a single P-47 Thunderbolt, for instance, demanded an extensive commitment of 5,500 man-hours, a stark contrast to the comparatively efficient 4,000 man-hours required for a P-51 Mustang. Its construction also necessitated a greater quantity of aluminum, more substantial amounts of steel, and a broader array of specialized, often more exotic materials. Consequently, the per-unit cost of a Thunderbolt ascended to a considerable $85,000, significantly higher than the Mustang's $51,000 price tag. However, soaring high above the embattled landscapes of France with his aircraft riddled by an estimated 200 bullet perforations, and his very existence hanging precariously on the resilience of its structural margins and the reliability of its redundant mechanisms, Johnson was undoubtedly experiencing the profound, life-saving worth of every single one of those additional 1,500 man-hours and the extra $34,000 invested. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. While the Thunderbolt might not have possessed an aesthetic grace or an inherent operational efficiency, its remarkable ability to remain airborne defied all logical expectations, which dictated that it should, by all accounts, have been strewn across the pastoral French countryside. The Luftwaffe's initial assurance in their capacity to swiftly eliminate P-47s was deeply rooted in their preceding 18 months of devastatingly effective triumphs against earlier generations of American fighter aircraft. Upon the initial deployment of P-38 Lightnings over the European theater in the latter part of 1942, German aviators rapidly discerned several critical vulnerabilities. The distinctive twin-engine configuration rendered the aircraft susceptible to an uncontrollable yawing motion if even one engine sustained damage, and the Allison engines themselves exhibited a tendency to overheat and fail when operating at higher altitudes. Pilots flying the formidable FW-190s consequently devised a standardized combat maneuver. They would specifically target a single engine, observe the P-38 violently twist into an irrecoverable spin, and then proceed to engage their subsequent prey. By the advent of spring 1943, intelligence dispatches from Luftwaffe squadrons formally categorized the P-38 as a top priority adversary, characterized by an exceptionally high probability of destruction. The P-40 Warhawk encountered an even more dismal fate when deployed in the European Air War. Originally conceived and engineered for low-altitude engagements prevalent in the North African and Pacific campaigns, The P-40 was comprehensively outmatched across every single performance metric by the superior German fighter aircraft models of 1943. Luftwaffe pilots, in fact, scarcely regarded them as credible threats. Its Allison engine proved incapable of generating sufficient power when operating above an altitude of 15,000 feet. Furthermore, the aircraft's airframe demonstrated a pronounced fragility under the rigors of sustained combat stress. Damage that a robust P-47 would effortlessly absorb and continue flying would invariably send a P-40 plummeting earthward, leaving a distinct trail of smoke and fire. Post-engagement analyses compiled by the Germans following operations in Tunisia and Sicily in early 1943 meticulously recorded kill ratios for the P-40 that decisively favored the Germans, often exceeding 3,1. As P-47 Thunderbolts began to proliferate in significant quantities during April 1943, the tactical analysis specialists within the Luftwaffe formulated what appeared at the time to be entirely rational hypotheses grounded in the intelligence data at their disposal. Their assessment concluded that the Americans had introduced yet another formidable heavyweight fighter, an aircraft of greater size and mass than any previously encountered, propelled by an immense radial engine. German intelligence accurately pinpointed the power plant as the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 and proceeded to compute its power-to-weight ratios, which in turn strongly indicated a deficiency in aerial maneuverability. Initial aerial engagements swiftly corroborated these preliminary forecasts. P-47s consistently proved unable to outmaneuver the agile FW-190s in turns, nor could they ascend as rapidly as the nimble Bf-109Gs, and they conspicuously appeared to eschew low-altitude dogfights altogether. Consequently, Jagdgeschwader II and JG-26, the elite Luftwaffe formations, tasked with safeguarding occupied France and the Low Countries, promptly revised their combat doctrines. Their updated attack briefings underscored the strategic imperative of capitalizing on the P-47's sluggish handling characteristics at lower speeds and the expansive blind spots inherent in its razorback canopy design. The prescribed engagement strategy advocated for aggressive diving attacks executed from a superior altitude and from the rear, leveraging the advantage of height to accumulate velocity, and then disengaging sharply before the Thunderbolt could effectively deploy its substantial armament. This carefully conceived tactic consistently yielded successful outcomes. Throughout April and the initial weeks of May 1943, P-47s sustained a consistent stream of losses attributable to these well-coordinated bounce attacks. German aviators additionally observed that the P-47s appeared particularly susceptible to engine damage. The aircraft's prominent radial engine presented an exceptionally large and inviting target area, and in stark contrast to inline engines, which were often neatly concealed behind aerodynamic cowlings, the R-2800's individual cylinders were overtly exposed to direct enemy fire. Consequently, Luftwaffe armament specialists advised concentrating fire directly upon the engine during head-on attack passes, utilizing the potent MG-151 Wankel 20mm cannon, typically loaded with a lethal combination of armor-piercing and high-explosive incendiary ammunition. The underlying premise of this strategy was that even if an immediate kill was not achieved, inflicting significant engine damage would compel the P-47 to disengage from the skirmish and retreat homeward, thereby effectively removing it from the ongoing aerial confrontation. What German intelligence critically failed to comprehend, however, was the profound fundamental distinction in the P-47's construction philosophy compared to every other Allied fighter aircraft they had thus far encountered. The Luftwaffe possessed vast and intimate experience in the art of destroying aerial platforms that had been designed and manufactured under the stringent constraints of peacetime weight restrictions and material resource limitations. For instance, iconic British aircraft such as the Spitfire and Hurricane employed highly efficient yet deliberately lightweight structural designs. Soviet fighter planes, conversely, were renowned for their inherent fragility, occasionally incorporating plywood elements into their construction to conserve vital strategic metals. Even the P-38 Lightning, despite its distinctive twin-engine configuration, had been engineered with a primary objective of minimizing overall weight, a design choice driven by the pursuit of enhanced performance characteristics. The P-47, by contrast, originated from an altogether distinct design philosophy, a paradigm made feasible by the immense industrial output of the United States, and a deliberate readiness to tolerate penalties in terms of aircraft weight in favor of vastly improved survivability. Consequently, Luftwaffe pilots possessed absolutely no prior frame of reference for an aircraft capable of enduring 50 or even 60 direct hits, and yet continuing to engage in combat. Their cumulative experience dictated that such an extensive degree of damage would inevitably lead to catastrophic structural failure, an uncontrollable fire, or an immediate, unavoidable forced landing. The very notion of an aircraft intentionally over-engineered to withstand and survive significant battle damage simply did not feature within their established tactical computations or expectations. This critical conceptual oversight permeated even the highest echelons of Luftwaffe command. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, a figure who himself possessed direct combat experience from the First World War, firmly held the conviction that an aircraft's ability to survive engagements stemmed primarily from the exceptional skill of its pilot and the deployment of audacious, aggressive tactics, rather than from inherent structural redundancy. The Luftwaffe, as an institutional principle, had historically designed and constructed its fighter aircraft to be exceptionally light and fast, willingly accepting a higher attrition rate in exchange for the perceived advantages in performance. Therefore, when intelligence dispatches began to circulate, indicating that P-47s were remarkably surviving aerial confrontations that, by all conventional wisdom, ought to have been fatal, the initial reaction from German command was one of profound skepticism. The prevailing assumption was that enemy pilots were either exaggerating the number of hits they scored, or that American airmen were merely experiencing an improbable streak of good fortune. Major Gerhard Schöpfel, a distinguished high-scoring ace commanding the 3 JG-26 Squadron, submitted a detailed report in late May 1943, recounting a particular engagement where he estimated he had pumped approximately 40 rounds into a P-47 without ever witnessing the aircraft crash. His commanding officers, however, immediately challenged the precision of his appraisal, positing that the intense psychological pressure of combat frequently resulted in an inflated count of successful hits. Schöpfel, unwavering, asserted the undeniable accuracy of his first-hand observations. The P-47, he maintained, had undeniably sustained multiple direct cannon strikes and had been visibly emitting smoke. Yet it had nevertheless maintained controlled flight for a sufficient duration to successfully make its escape across the English Channel. The ingrained institutional self-assurance within the Luftwaffe persisted throughout May 1943, largely because the prevailing statistical data appeared to validate their established combat methodologies. They were demonstrably achieving successful shoot-downs of P-47s at rates that, while not as overwhelmingly advantageous as those against the P-40s, still constituted what they considered acceptable exchange ratios. What they critically failed to discern, however, was that they were inadvertently observing a phenomenon of selection bias. The specific P-47s that they successfully destroyed were predominantly those that had suffered either catastrophic hits directly to the pilot or experienced critical single-point system failures. Conversely, those aircraft that survived with extensive, albeit non-fatal, battle damage were simply not being factored into German loss assessments, precisely because they were not crashing on the French side of the Channel, thus escaping observation and categorization as confirmed kills. Johnson's battered Thunderbolt eventually traversed the French coastline at a precarious altitude of scarcely 8,000 feet, steadily relinquishing height at an approximate rate of 200 feet per minute, despite his most determined endeavors to sustain a level flight path. The aircraft's engine was operating on borrowed time, undergoing a relentless mechanical degradation. The temperatures within the cylinder heads had soared to such extreme levels that the corresponding gauge needles were firmly lodged beyond their maximum indicated readings. With alarming regularity, every few seconds, the engine would falter, skipping a beat, emitting a harsh cough, violently shuddering, only to then resume its agonizingly strained rotation. Johnson could discern and feel each individual misfire distinctly propagating as a palpable vibration throughout the entire airframe, and he possessed an innate, visceral understanding that he was merely counting down the precious moments until the engine would inevitably experience a complete and irreversible failure. Beneath him, the vast expanse of the English Channel unfolded, a formidable 40-mile stretch of frigid, uninviting gray water that, considering the dire state of his aircraft, felt as insurmountable as an entire ocean. Johnson meticulously performed the necessary mental calculations, and the resulting prognosis was grim and deeply unsettling. Factoring in his current descent rate of 200 feet per minute, and a forward airspeed of 180 miles per hour, he would inevitably impact the water a full 15 miles short of the welcoming English coast. While theoretically, ditching a P-47 in tempestuous seas offered a slim chance of survival, the aircraft's broad fuselage and large radial engine inherently provided a degree of buoyancy. Actual survival hinged critically on the pilot remaining fully conscious and physically unharmed during the moment of impact. Johnson, however, had already sustained shrapnel injuries. His crucial depth perception was severely impaired by the extensively cracked canopy, and he lacked any hydraulic power for the landing gear, a critical malfunction that guaranteed the wheels would remain retracted, ensuring that the aircraft's belly would bear the brunt of the initial water strike. The damaged P-47 Thunderbolt, its underbelly poised to strike the ground first, represented a desperate gamble for survival. Johnson, the pilot, again attempted to contact air-sea rescue via his radio, despite knowing its circuits were completely incapacitated. The resulting static and silence confirmed his isolation, There was no way to alert any RAF coastal stations about his crippled American fighter, nor to request the immediate assistance it would undoubtedly require. He found himself utterly alone, grappling with a mortally wounded aircraft and making split-second decisions that would determine whether he would rest in a comfortable English bed that evening or become another name added to the grim roll of those missing in action. Despite Johnson's most diligent efforts, the engine's temperature continued its relentless climb. He had conscientiously reduced power to the absolute minimum for cruise flight, carefully adjusting the fuel mixture as much as he dared, but the internal damage was far too extensive. Within the engine's core, metal grated against metal, bearings ran without their vital lubrication, and pistons relentlessly scored the cylinder walls with every arduous stroke. The distinct, acrid odor of an engine consuming itself now permeated the cockpit, even through his oxygen mask. This potent mix of hot metal and burning oil, a smell universally recognized by pilots, served as an ominous harbinger of imminent and catastrophic mechanical failure. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Just 10 miles from the French coastline, the propeller abruptly began windmilling in an erratic fashion. Johnson immediately detected the profound alteration. Instead of its customary smooth rotation, the propeller was now catching and releasing, a clear indication that the compromised engine could no longer provide consistent power. He manipulated the propeller pitch control, but it yielded no response. The hydraulic system, which governed the blade angle, had been completely destroyed during that second perilous pass over France. Consequently, the propeller was now fixed at whatever pitch it had settled into, a setting far from optimal for the meager power the failing engine could still generate. In a moment of critical clarity, Johnson made a decision that likely preserved his life. Rather than attempting to maintain altitude, a strategy that would have inevitably resulted in ditching into the treacherous channel, he resolved to accept a controlled descent, leveraging his remaining altitude to gain precious distance. He deliberately nosed the P-47 into a shallow dive, effectively trading vertical height for increased airspeed and miles covered. The rate of descent consequently increased to 400 feet per minute, but his ground speed simultaneously accelerated to 220 mph. The engine, however, protested against this heightened load. Temperatures surged even higher and misfiring became more frequent, yet, against all odds, it stubbornly continued to operate. 5 miles from the French coast, Johnson found himself at a mere 4,000 feet. The mathematical calculations for survival were becoming increasingly grim. If the engine were to fail at this precise moment, he might reach the channel. But making it to England would be an absolute impossibility. The coastline was now vividly clear to him. The imposing cliffs and pristine beaches that delineated the boundary between occupied Europe and the expansive open water. Every single mile was paramount. Every minute the engine defiantly continued to run was an unearned gift, one he desperately needed. The French coast receded beneath him at 13:47 hours, exactly 32 minutes after the initial enemy attack. Johnson was now at 3,200 feet, still steadily descending, with the engine producing perhaps only 60% of its rated power and steadily diminishing. The vast expanse of the channel stretched before him, And for the first time since enduring those devastating hits, Johnson permitted himself the faint hope that he might actually succeed. The English coast appeared as a dark, slender line on the distant horizon, approximately 30 miles away. Given his current descent rate and speed, the calculations were exceedingly tight, yet undeniably possible. Then, without warning, the engine seized. It was not a gradual demise, nor did it offer any preliminary coughs or splutters. Instead, one moment it was running roughly, the next it was utterly locked solid. The propeller froze rigidly in place, halted mid-rotation by internal damage that had finally surpassed even the R-2800's legendary tolerances. The sudden onset of silence was overwhelming. Johnson had been subjected to the torturous sounds of that dying engine for a full half-hour, its grinding and coughing, having become an almost normal background drone. Now there was nothing but the plaintive whistle of the wind and the ominous creaking of the damaged airframe. At 2,000 feet of altitude, 28 miles from the English coast, Johnson found himself gliding in a thoroughly shot-up fighter, devoid of engine power, hydraulics, and possessing only marginal control authority. He mentally performed the glide ratio calculation. A P-47, even under ideal conditions, was known to glide with the aerodynamic grace of a brick, typically covering about 8 feet forward for every foot of altitude lost. With battle damage and a frozen propeller generating immense drag, that ratio was probably closer to 6-1. He required a staggering 940 feet of glide distance to traverse 28 miles. At his current 2,000 feet of altitude, he had at best perhaps 12,000 feet of glide available. The mathematics were unequivocally impossible. He was not going to make it. Defying all aerodynamic predictions, Johnson somehow reached the English coast at a mere 200 feet. The Thunderbolt's glide had been extended far beyond what was reasonably expected, a miraculous feat achieved through a potent combination of sheer desperation and minute, precise control inputs that kept the aircraft precariously balanced on the very edge of a stall. He had traversed the final 15 miles in a descent so incredibly shallow that the laws of physics should have rendered it impossible. Yet through some confluence of the P-47, his substantial wing area, and Johnson's profound, almost instinctive understanding of energy management, he had meticulously extracted every conceivable foot of distance from the available altitude. He cleared the iconic White Cliffs with a perilous clearance of perhaps 50 feet, close enough to discern individual seabirds scattering from the sheer rock face. The nearest RAF station within his reach was Hawkinge, a relatively small fighter base situated near Folkestone, which had bravely served on the front lines during the Battle of Britain 3 years prior. Johnson possessed no functional radio to communicate ahead, no flares to signal an emergency, nothing but a dying aircraft plummeting towards English farmland at a speed of 150 miles. He spotted the airfield 2 miles directly ahead, its grass runways meticulously laid out in the standard RAF triangular pattern, and committed himself to a straight-in approach with absolutely no possibility of a go-around. The predicament of the landing gear presented an immediate and intractable problem, as there was no viable solution. Without hydraulic power, both the main gear and the tail wheel remained irrevocably locked in the retracted position. While P-47s were capable of belly landing, a procedure detailed in the pilot's handbook and practiced by ground crews in training, the manual implicitly assumed a controlled approach with fully functional flaps and elevator authority. Johnson, however, possessed neither. His flaps, being hydraulically operated, were entirely useless. His elevator cables were partially severed, affording him perhaps only 20% of normal pitch control. He would be forced to land at a dangerously high speed, nose high, and utterly incapable of executing a proper flare. Johnson configured his approach guided more by raw instinct than established procedure, manipulating the few systems that still responded to his input. Unable to lower the flaps, his approach speed would be perilously high, likely around 140 km/h across the threshold, in stark contrast to the normal 90 kph with flaps extended. He could not adjust the propeller, which remained frozen at whatever pitch it had seized in, thereby creating tremendous aerodynamic drag. His mixture control was jammed. The throttle was utterly irrelevant given the absence of an engine, and most of his instruments lay destroyed. He was flying by visual cues and tactile feel, much in the manner that pilots had landed aircraft before the advent of instrument panels. The Hawking duty officer, upon spotting the severely damaged P-47 on its final approach, immediately scrambled the crash crew. Even from the ground, the aircraft's dire condition was patently obvious. Visible holes marred its wings, a section of the tail was conspicuously absent, the canopy was fractured, and dark streaks, potentially oil stains or burn marks, scarred the fuselage. The mere fact that it was still airborne seemed an impossibility. The pilot's decision to attempt a landing rather than bailing out appeared nothing short of insane. Johnson crossed the airfield boundary at 100 feet, the P-47 descending more rapidly than he desired, yet still controllable in the most lenient sense of the word. He gently eased back on the stick, endeavoring to arrest the descent, and the aircraft responded sluggishly. The ground rushed upwards, the expansive grass fields swiftly giving way to the mowed runway surface, and Johnson realized with absolute clarity that he was going to impact the earth violently. He wrenched the stick back as far as it would travel, the compromised elevator cables stretching taut, and the Thunderbolt, his nose lifted perhaps 5 degrees, just enough to transform the impact angle from catastrophic to merely brutal. The P-47 struck the grass runway belly first at 135 km/h. The impact was instantaneous and utterly violent. 7 tons of aircraft decelerated from highway speed to zero within the span of 400 yards. The belly skin tore away in ragged strips, metal grinding against the earth and grass with a sound that witnesses later described as a terrifying fusion of thunder and a freight train derailing. Dirt and debris erupted in a fountain around the fuselage. The propeller blades bent severely backward as they dug into the ground. The right wing flexed sharply upward, its damaged spar finally succumbing under the immense impact loads. For a fleeting moment, it appeared as though the entire wing would separate, yet it remarkably held fast. The Thunderbolt plowed relentlessly across the grass, shedding parts and momentum in equal measure, leaving a dramatic rooster tail of dirt and aviation fuel in its wake. Johnson was violently slammed forward against his harness, the shoulder straps digging painfully into flesh, already bruised and bleeding from shrapnel wounds. His head snapped forward and collided with the gun sight, opening a gash above his right eye that instantly obscured his vision with a torrent of blood. The deceleration felt infinite, akin to being crushed by unseen, powerful hands. Every organ was compressed against bone, his lungs emptying involuntarily. The aircraft finally came to a halt, 380 yards from the initial impact point, roughly aligned with the runway, but canted 15 degrees to the right where the damaged wing had dug deeply into the soil. The crippled wing had finally embedded itself into the earth. And profound quietude enveloped the scene, punctuated solely by the rhythmic clicking of the cooling metal of the aircraft and the faint, yet steadily approaching wail of emergency fire vehicles. Within the confines of the cockpit, Johnson remained motionless, his mind struggling to comprehend the astonishing reality of his presence on English soil, miraculously still alive. His hands, rigid and aching, were still clamped firmly around the control stick and throttle, his muscles severely cramped from the unyielding, desperate hold he had maintained for the preceding 45 minutes. The aircraft's canopy, a vital escape route, was irrevocably jammed, its structural integrity compromised and twisted by the immense forces of the impact. Johnson attempted to activate the emergency jettison system, but met with utter failure. There was no hydraulic pressure, no compressed air reserves, absolutely nothing. He found himself inextricably confined within the mangled wreckage of an airplane that presented an immediate threat of conflagration, with volatile fuel and lubricating oil saturating the superheated metallic components. Remarkably swiftly, the dedicated crash response team converged upon the P-47 within a mere 90 seconds. Firefighters, an organized flurry of activity, swarmed over the aircraft's body, wielding axes and crowbars, systematically assailing the stubborn canopy frame with specialized implements specifically engineered for the arduous task of extricating pilots from severely damaged fighter planes. With considerable effort, they managed to pry the canopy open, whereupon Johnson practically tumbled out, his legs seizing up from the combined effects of significant blood loss and profound shock. A waiting medical officer skillfully intercepted him, gently guiding him to the ground, and promptly commenced a preliminary evaluation of his injuries. Throughout this process, Johnson reiterated a singular, insistent demand. "Count the holes. You need to count the holes." The medical officer, initially surmising that Johnson was experiencing delirium brought on by the traumatic event, found his assumptions challenged when Johnson forcefully grasped his arm, repeating his plea with such fervent intensity that the officer, acknowledging the pilot's urgency, nodded reassuringly and affirmed that the diligent ground crew would indeed undertake a thorough and comprehensive damage assessment. Before we delve deeper into this incredible saga, we invite you to stay with us and witness the full unfolding of this remarkable story. Until the very end of this video, your support, through a like and a subscription, would be profoundly appreciated. Please also consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below, letting us know where you are tuning in from and what your perspective is on the extraordinary resilience highlighted in this narrative. The critical responsibility for conducting the damage assessment fell to Staff Sergeant Arthur Williams, an experienced armorer and seasoned ground crew chief whose expertise in aircraft maintenance predated the commencement of hostilities. Williams possessed extensive familiarity with the sight of combat-scarred aircraft, having witnessed numerous P-47s bearing the marks of anti-aircraft fire, machine gun perforations, and even the devastating impact of cannon rounds, valiantly returning from missions over France. However, as he initiated his methodical walk-around inspection of Johnson's Thunderbolt on the afternoon of May 26th, he found himself so utterly astonished by the sheer extent of the destruction that he ceased his tally after examining just the initial wing panel, immediately recognizing the unprecedented nature of the damage, and proceeded directly to locate his commanding officer. The formal evaluation was meticulously carried out the subsequent morning, May 27th, complete with comprehensive documentation and extensive photographic evidence. Staff Sergeant Williams, accompanied by 2 assistants, utilized a clipboard affixed with specialized grid sheets, specifically designed to precisely chart the damage locations onto standard P-47 schematics. Their methodical survey commenced at the aircraft's nose and systematically progressed toward the tail, diligently noting every perforation, every rupture, and every instance where German projectiles, both bullets and shells, had violently compromised the airframe's integrity. This painstaking process extended over a period of 4 hours. The ultimate tally revealed an astonishing 203 distinct impact points, a figure so extraordinary that Williams initially found it beyond belief, necessitating 2 thorough recounts to ensure absolute verification. The intricate configuration of the damage vividly recounted the narrative of Johnson's aerial confrontation with forensic precision. The right wing alone had sustained an astonishing 68 direct strikes, with the majority of these concentrated within a concentrated 6-foot segment, where a 20mm cannon shell had catastrophically detonated within the critical main spar. This explosive force had utterly obliterated the internal structural components, leaving the external wing skin severely shredded and hanging in ragged strips. Despite such devastating trauma, the forward spar had, against all odds, retained sufficient structural integrity to prevent the entire wing from detaching. Furthermore, 3 distinct penetrations in the fuel tanks were clearly discernible, each surrounded by the characteristic bulging of the specialized self-sealing compound, which had miraculously sealed the breaches and averted any significant loss of vital fuel. The aircraft's fuselage presented an equally harrowing tableau, displaying 114 individual impact points extending from the immediate vicinity of the engine all the way to the rear tail section. A number of these projectiles had completely perforated both sides of the fuselage, entering one flank and exiting the other after tearing through the intricate internal framework. Notably, a single 20mm shell had penetrated the airframe a mere 18 inches behind the cockpit, then traversed forward at an acute angle, ultimately embedding itself, unexploded, within the radio equipment bay. The Ordnance Disposal Team, tasked with its delicate removal, subsequently verified that it was indeed a high explosive round that had, by some extraordinary fluke, failed to detonate. This was nothing short of sheer, unadulterated fortune, which had undeniably prevented the warhead from simultaneously obliterating both the cockpit and the pilot within. The devastation inflicted upon the tail section was so profound and widespread that Staff Sergeant Williams, in his initial assessment, categorized the aircraft as being beyond any economically viable repair. The vertical stabilizer bore the scars of 21 distinct perforations, among which 3 had gouged out substantial portions of the rudder, creating apertures large enough to allow visual passage directly through the component. Each of the horizontal stabilizers exhibited 16 impacts, with one elevator suffering near complete destruction. Ironically, the very same elevator Johnson had utilized to maintain command of the aircraft during his astonishing landing. The persistence of any discernible control authority was ultimately credited to the P-47's ingeniously designed, redundant cable routing system, a feature that ensured partial operational capacity even when primary control cables had been compromised or severed. The aircraft's colossal engine presented an equally compelling testament to mechanical improbability. Upon removing the cowling, Williams and his dedicated team discovered an R-2800 power plant that appeared as though it had been subjected to sustained target practice. 3 of its cylinders had absorbed direct hits, one so extensively damaged that the piston itself was plainly visible through a gaping aperture in the cylinder wall. The accessory case lay shattered, the vital oil pump utterly destroyed, and the magneto housing displayed undeniable impact damage, injuries that, under normal circumstances, should have instantly halted all ignition. Yet, against all logical expectations, this remarkably resilient engine had inexplicably continued to function for a staggering 32 minutes subsequent to the initial enemy engagement, miraculously generating sufficient thrust to sustain Johnson's flight across 50 perilous miles of hostile airspace and treacherous open water. In early June, Alexander Cartway, the esteemed chief engineer for Republic Aviation, was presented with the comprehensive damage assessment report, accompanied by a collection of photographs. His initial assumption upon viewing these images was that they represented composites, assembled from the wreckage of several distinct aircraft. However, once irrefutable confirmation arrived that the entirety of the depicted damage originated from a singular P-47, Cartway promptly submitted a request for the aircraft's immediate shipment back to the Republic factory situated in Farmingdale, New York, for an exhaustive engineering analysis. This extraordinary request was duly approved, and Johnson's P-47, bearing the serial number 428487, subsequently embarked upon its transatlantic journey within the secure hold of a cargo ship, returning to its homeland not as a battle-hardened weapon of war, but as an invaluable test specimen for unparalleled study. By mid-June 1943, the 8th Air Force had disseminated the remarkable damage assessment report to every P-47 fighter group stationed across England. This crucial document incorporated Williams's compelling photographs alongside a detailed technical analysis provided by Republic's engineering experts, which meticulously elucidated the astonishing reasons behind the aircraft's survival. Group commanders subsequently integrated this compelling documentation into their pilot briefings, presenting irrefutable, tangible evidence that the P-47 possessed an unparalleled capacity to withstand battle damage that would undoubtedly obliterate any other fighter aircraft operating within the European theater. The resultant psychological impact on the flying personnel was profound and far-reaching. Pilots who had previously harbored reservations or questions regarding their aircraft's resilience now possessed concrete validation that the formidable Thunderbolt truly honored its formidable reputation for toughness. Within a mere fortnight, intelligence networks within the German Luftwaffe were abuzz with news of Johnson's improbable survival. German pilots, engaged in operations over the English Channel, had indeed observed the heavily smoking P-47 as it laboriously traversed the coastline, and had, quite logically, presumed its imminent crash a tragically standard conclusion for any aircraft sustaining such catastrophic damage. However, when subsequent intercepted radio communications and thorough prisoner interrogations unequivocally corroborated that not only had the pilot endured the ordeal, but the aircraft itself had been successfully brought down to earth. Luftwaffe tactical analysis officers immediately embarked upon a critical re-evaluation of their established engagement doctrines. These pivotal reports reached Major Gerhard Schopfel, a prominent figure at JG-26, in late June, coinciding with a growing number of similar accounts from other German pilots detailing P-47s absorbing seemingly fatal damage and, against all odds, managing to disengage and escape. Schopfel promptly revised his tactical briefings to incorporate this startling new reality. The P-47 was unequivocally not a facile target. Engagements, he instructed, now demanded a more precise targeting of the American fighter's critical vulnerabilities, and pilots were cautioned against the erroneous assumption that merely visible damage implied an imminent and certain crash. Consequently, the recommended ammunition load underwent a significant alteration, shifting from a balanced mixture of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds to a greater concentration of armor-piercing projectiles, specifically engineered to penetrate deeply into vital internal systems, rather than merely inflicting visually dramatic, but ultimately non-fatal superficial damage. By August 1943, the official Luftwaffe doctrine had been explicitly amended to caution against disengaging from attacks on damaged P-47s, unless the American fighter was unequivocally observed to be engulfed in flames or engaged in an uncontrolled terminal descent. German pilots received stringent instructions to pursue compromised Thunderbolts across the English Channel, provided their fuel reserves allowed, with the explicit objective of confirming actual crashes, rather than prematurely claiming probable kills based solely on visible, yet often superficial, damage. This significant doctrinal shift represented a fundamental reorientation in German tactical philosophy, a transformation compelled by the mounting, undeniable evidence that American ingenuity had successfully forged a fighter aircraft that seemed to operate under an entirely distinct set of operational rules than anything they had previously confronted on the battlefield. On June 13, 1943, a mere 18 days after undertaking a mission that, by all rational measures, should have proven fatal, Johnson made his triumphant return to active combat operations. The 56th Fighter Group furnished him with a brand new P-47, which he piloted with an unmistakable elevated level of self-assurance that was immediately apparent to his fellow aviators. There exists a profound psychological metamorphosis that occurs within a pilot who endures an ordeal deemed truly unsurvivable. Such an experience either utterly shatters their spirit, or conversely, it forges within them an aggressive, almost indomitable fearlessness, founded upon a newly proven sense of invincibility. Johnson, without question, belonged to the latter category. He had been mercilessly riddled with enemy fire, yet he had endured. The formidable Luftwaffe had unleashed its most destructive efforts, and still he had managed to land safely back in England. The very aircraft that many had criticized as being excessively heavy, too sluggish, and overly susceptible to damage, had remarkably absorbed 203 distinct impacts and had steadfastly carried him home. This newfound, unshakable confidence rapidly permeated throughout the 56th Fighter Group and extended its influence far beyond. Pilots who had previously approached the P-47's capabilities with cautious experimentation now flew with greater audacity, extended their engagements in dogfights for longer durations, and embraced risks they had previously deemed unacceptable. The profound realization that their aircraft possessed an astonishing capacity to absorb immense punishment and continue flying fundamentally recalibrated their tactical calculations. Whereas a P-47 pilot might once have disengaged after sustaining a handful of hits, they now meticulously assessed the extent of the damage and frequently chose to remain actively engaged in combat, provided their critical systems largely remained operational. The Thunderbolt had transcended its identity as merely a fighter aircraft. It had evolved into a potent psychological weapon, imbuing American pilots with a quantifiable courage that the German Luftwaffe simply could not fathom or counter. Robert Johnson, through his extraordinary resilience, became the living embodiment of Republic Aviation's engineering prowess, serving as a dynamic testament to the P-47 Thunderbolt's robust design. By the cessation of hostilities, his formidable combat record boasted an impressive 27 confirmed aerial victories, firmly positioning him among the preeminent American aces operating in the European theater. He fearlessly undertook 91 arduous combat missions, enduring yet another instance of being shot down, remarkably once more in a P-47, and again successfully navigating his damaged aircraft back to safety. His unparalleled experiences prompted fellow aviators to earnestly seek his counsel, inquiring about his tactical methodologies and striving to comprehend the intricate means by which he had managed to guide his severely damaged Thunderbolt across the vast expanse of the English Channel. His unwavering response consistently emphasized a core philosophy: absolute trust in the aircraft's inherent capabilities, a profound understanding of its intricate systems, and an unyielding commitment to never abandon a P-47 until it had unequivocally ceased to be physically capable of flight. This profound shift in pilot mindset yielded quantifiable benefits for American fighter operations by the close of 1943. The P-47's alarming loss rates per sortie, which had peaked during April and May, precipitously declined to approximately 0.2% by September, even as the intensity and frequency of aerial engagements escalated dramatically. While a portion of this marked improvement could be attributed to the accumulation of pilot experience and the refinement of combat tactics, a substantial and critical contribution stemmed directly from pilots' increased willingness to remain with their damaged aircraft, rather than resorting to premature bailouts. Aircraft that, under previous operational doctrines, would have been irrevocably classified as lost, instead successfully returned to their bases in England, underwent meticulous repair procedures, and were subsequently redeployed into active combat. Consequently, the effective, operational strength of the 8th Air Force's fighter arm experienced a significant augmentation. Without the introduction of a single new aircraft, the strategic advantage was simply derived from keeping a greater number of damaged machines aloft and operational. Republic Aviation, recognizing the profound significance of Johnson's astonishing survival, meticulously integrated his experience into a wide array of training materials and technical documentation. The company meticulously compiled and disseminated a comprehensive case study detailing the extraordinary 203-hit incident, distributing this vital information to military procurement offices across the Allied nations and to the various Allied air forces. This meticulously crafted documentation served a dual critical purpose. It unequivocally validated Republic's foundational design decisions, and it furnished undeniable concrete evidence for the inherent value of robust construction, even when such resilience necessitated additional weight and incurred greater manufacturing expenses. When critics vociferously questioned the P-47's comparatively higher cost relative to other contemporary fighter aircraft, Republic could powerfully counter these arguments by presenting compelling photographs of Johnson's battle-scarred aircraft, posing the rhetorical question of what ultimate price one would reasonably assign to the preservation of a pilot's life. The Luftwaffe's subsequent recalibration of its aerial tactics, necessitated by the P-47's unexpected and formidable durability, initiated a pervasive, cascading effect throughout German fighter operations during the latter half of 1943. Pilots who had previously approached engagements with Thunderbolts with a degree of confident aggression now adopted a stance of pronounced caution, having learned through bitter experience that merely inflicting damage upon a P-47 no longer guaranteed a definitive kill. This newfound circumspection invariably translated into protracted engagement times, which in turn meant German fighters were dedicating less precious time to their primary objective of attacking Allied bomber formations. This reduction in bomber attacks directly contributed to a discernible improvement in bomber survival rates. The P-47's burgeoning reputation as an almost indestructible damage sponge began to exert its psychological influence even before the first shots were exchanged. German pilots found themselves compelled to commit a greater allocation of resources and undertake significantly elevated risks to achieve kills that, in earlier encounters, had often been secured with comparative ease. Quantitative evidence supporting this tactical shift is vividly presented in German ammunition expenditure statistics meticulously compiled from Luftwaffe quartermaster reports. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. In April 1943, the average expenditure of ammunition required to achieve a single confirmed P-47 kill stood at approximately 220 rounds for 20mm cannon and 850 rounds for machine guns. However, by October 1943, these figures had alarmingly escalated to a staggering 380 cannon rounds and an even more substantial 1,400 machine gun rounds for each verified P-47 kill. This stark increase indicated that German pilots were not only discharging more ammunition but also registering a higher number of hits. Yet they required a significantly greater volume of impacts to achieve the same desired outcome. This profound and escalating inefficiency reverberated throughout the entirety of the Luftwaffe's complex supply chain, placing immense strain on critical ammunition production facilities and logistical networks precisely at a juncture when the relentless Allied strategic bombing campaign was specifically targeting these very industrial systems. Beyond the tactical and logistical ramifications, a significant psychological dimension of the P-47's resilience extended to the Allied bomber crews themselves. Gunners aboard B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators frequently witnessed their P-47 escorts absorb visible and often extensive battle damage, yet defiantly continue their engagement with enemy aircraft, a sight that profoundly bolstered morale during the terrifying and perilous bomber runs deep into German territory. Prior to mid-1943, fighter escorts that sustained hits typically disengaged from combat and initiated their return journey home, thereby leaving the vulnerable bomber formations dangerously exposed. The inspiring spectacle of shot-up Thunderbolts, steadfastly remaining in the fray, persistently engaging German fighters, even while trailing telltale plumes of smoke, instilled a renewed and profound confidence among bomber crews that their escorts would not abandon them at the initial manifestation of adversity. Johnson's extraordinary narrative transcended mere anecdote, rapidly solidifying into an enduring legend. Within the 8th Air Force, a tale recounted and retold countless times in the ready rooms across airfields throughout England. Newly arrived replacement pilots, fresh from their training in the United States, were often regaled with the astonishing saga of the 203-hit Thunderbolt, even before they embarked on their inaugural combat mission. This compelling story served a dual vital purpose. It functioned as a powerful source of inspiration, demonstrating that survival was indeed possible even amidst the most dire and seemingly insurmountable circumstances, and simultaneously as a crucial instructional tool, imparting the understanding that the P-47 possessed a toughness far exceeding its outward appearance, thereby meriting the absolute trust of its pilot. Robert Johnson had incontrovertibly demonstrated that Alexander Cartway's renowned, almost obsessive approach to over-engineering was not an exercise in wasteful excess, but rather a profound manifestation of wisdom, that every additional pound of structural integrity and every redundant system incorporated into the design served a vital purpose, ultimately measured in the precious currency of lives saved and critical missions successfully completed. The P-47 Thunderbolt subsequently went on to accomplish more operational missions than any other American fighter aircraft in the European theater, accumulating an unparalleled combat record that resoundingly validated every initially controversial design decision made by Republic Aviation. It destroyed a greater number of ground targets, flew more essential escort missions, and successfully brought more pilots home than many lighter, ostensibly more elegant fighter designs that appeared superior on paper. Johnson's remarkable survival on May 26, 1943, thus served as the definitive proof of concept, fundamentally altering how all involved parties, Americans, British, and Germans alike, understood the absolute limits of an aircraft's endurance. The Luftwaffe, in the aftermath of this revelation, never again casually dismissed Thunderbolts as easy kills, for Johnson had demonstrated to them in the most unambiguous and decisive manner possible that destroying a P-47 demanded far more than merely hitting it. It necessitated the complete annihilation of something that steadfastly refused to be destroyed.